Hello, class. Today we're going to cover chapter 10, and in this chapter we'll be covering Western musical instruments. So, starting with the string instruments, or also known as the chordophones, here we have bowed instruments, and that includes the violin, viola, violoncello, or also known as the cello, double bass, also known as the contrabass or bass viol. And with these instruments, we can utilize certain special effects in the music. So the first one is legato, which means for the notes to be played smoothly and connected. Next, we have staccato, where the notes are short and detached. As you're listening, it might sound a little bit pecky, but there's a lot of space, silence in between those notes. Next is pizzicato, and that is when the strings are plucked with the fingers instead of using the bow. Next is vibrato, where the string player does a rapid wrist and finger movement, which so if their finger is pressed against the string and they're kind of wiggling it, and it's a quick succession where the pitch is altered. And another way to think of it is you have the pitch in tune, out of tune, in tune, out of tune, like really moving in between those two types of pitches. Remember when I talked about how I first started playing vibrato with my tuba, and my teacher laughed at me because it sounded like my teeth were chattering. I'm going in between the actual pitch and a slightly off tune pitch. My sound wasn't very natural, but if you listen to great players, it feels kind of like a motor or engine that's like propelling you forward. All right, after vibrato, we have glissando. And the glissando is when the string player uses their finger and slides it along the actual string. So as they're moving from their finger furthest away from their body, closer to their body, you'll hear like a and the closer that their finger slides up the instrument to where their bow might be, that's when the notes get higher. Next, we have tremolo. And tremolo is a rapid repetition of a tone. When you hear that, it's reminiscent of some music that might be like really exciting or danger, like da 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 da, like just they're really digging in there, and that effect really can change the mood of the music. Here we have a picture of Hilary Hahn, who's a Grammy Award-winning violinist, and she enjoys a prominent career as a soloist. And on the right, we have Yo-Yo Ma. He is a revered and wide-ranging virtuoso cellist. He's pretty awesome. All right, back to more techniques. Next, we have the trill, and a trill is a rapid alternation of two adjacent tones. So in Western music, that would be the distance of a half step usually. And this is very prevalent in marches, especially like what the flutes or piccolo or even the clarinet would do. Just it's very ornamental. So the string players do that technique as well. Next, we have double stopping, and that's when the string player plays two strings at the same time to create a harmony with the bow. Usually the bow strikes across one string, but to double stop, they're crossing the bow against two strings at the same time. So in a way, they can play duets with themselves. Next is a mute. And a mute is a little attachment that they put over the bridge, and it muffles the sound. So that changes the timbre of the sound of the instrument. Sometimes it's to create a softer atmosphere or mood, depending on what the composer wants. But it will dampen the resonance and the volume of the instrument. Next is harmonics, and that is when the string player lightly touches the string. Instead of fully pressing the string down, the light touch will create an overtone where we hear high-pitched tones. It's kind of ethereal or ghostly sounding if you're listening to it and describing it. So now we talked about the bowed instruments. Now we're going to talk about the plucked instruments, the plucked string instruments. Next, the first one is the harp, and this is one of the oldest instruments. But nowadays with the design of the harp, the pitches are changed by the pedals. Now the really cool thing about the harp is once you have the pedal set in a certain way, that all the strings are set to that particular key. So if you need to move from one key to the next, your feet, the harp player's feet, are going to be doing a little dance and, unhooking and hooking the right pedals to make sure they're in the right key. Also, arpeggios. They're really known for arpeggios, where instead of playing the chord where you're striking or playing 3 notes at the same time, the arpeggio is a broken chord where you play one note after another. Little interesting fact, the Greek name for harp is arpa, which is part of arpeggio, so it's broken chord. The next plucked instrument is the guitar, and that instrument dates back to the Middle Ages. We have the acoustic guitar, which is made out of wood and has a fretted fingerboard with nylon or steel strings. We also have the electric guitar, which is electronically amplified. There's also the electroacoustic guitar, which is a little bit in the middle. The next plucked instrument is the banjo, mandolin, and these are related to the guitar. Here we have some pictures of the harp, and on the right, if you can tell, the strings are color-coded to kind of help the harpist position her hands as she plucks the strings. The harp, think of it like the piano, where the keys are the pitches keep repeating as they go further down the instrument. And you can see that there's a couple different red ones. Those are kind of showing you where the octaves are. So imagine playing on a harp with no colors and kind of having to know where you are on the harp. So at first you're going to have to color code, just like if you're learning piano, you might have to maybe put little stickers on the keys to kind of keep track of where you are. And on the left here, I have another picture of a harp, and then I also have a zoomed in shot of where the pedals are. And so the harpist will need to wear a specific kind of shoe to make sure that you can move your pedals properly, to unlatch and latch them, to make sure that the player is playing in the right key. And sometimes those transitions are very quick, so they got to practice that a lot. All right, here we have some more pictures of some string instruments. On the left here is American Christian McBride. He's playing double bass at a jazz festival in East Sussex, England in 2014. And on the right, we have bass guitarist Ricardo Winandy, who's performing in a Brazilian progressive band called Mindflow. All right, so we talked about the string instruments, the chordophones. Now we're going to talk about the woodwind instruments, the aerophones. And these instruments, the sound is produced by air, and finger holes change the pitch. So you're blowing air through some sort of column, and your fingers are opening and closing on holes, and that changes the pitch. So these instruments, even though it's called woodwind, they're not always made out of wood. Originally, back in the day, they would have been. So with the flute family, the instrumentalist will blow air across the mouth hole, and the flute and the piccolo are both made out of metal. Then we have the oboe and bassoon families, and these are double reed instruments. So I kind of talked about this a little bit in class, but the double reed, you'll have two pieces of a cane wood that's been filed down, and they're strapped together. And there's just a tiny little bit of space in between the two pieces of wood, and the instrumentalist would put that in their mouth, and they would blow the air through, and the vibration of those two pieces of wood hitting each other would produce that sound. And as they're producing that sound, their fingers are covering holes and opening holes, and that's changing the pitch. So in this oboe and bassoon family, we have the oboe, the English horn, the bassoon, and the contrabassoon. Now, the contrabassoon is the lowest instrument in the woodwind family. Just like the contrabass or double bass is the lowest sounding instrument in the string family. Next, in the clarinet and saxophone families, these are the single reed instruments. So instead of having a double reed like the oboe or bassoon, it's just one piece of cane that's been filed down. And as the instrumentalist will blow the air through the mouthpiece, the single reed will vibrate. Now within this single reed family, we have the clarinet, the bass clarinet, and the saxophone. But the saxophone is made out of metal. So it's kind of a combination, or, I don't want to say Frankensteinian experiment, but it's a blend of the brass, like a brass instrument, with the woodwind capabilities. And so the saxophones are made out of metal, while, the clarinets are made out of wood or some composite. I had the opportunity to go to the Conn-Selmer factory over in Indiana, and I got to see how they create these instruments. And the process for creating the clarinets and the woodwind, all the other woodwind instruments, is quite long. It takes years. The wood has to acclimate. They get it from a specific rainforest, jungle area, and it's just really amazing how much care goes into creating these instruments. And then when they finally get to the performer's hands, and then they work on them and play, and then the beautiful sound is created, it's really an art form. All right, and I'll show you some pictures of some of that trip a little bit later. So here we have a picture of Sir James Galway, and he is like one of the greatest flautist players ever. He's been nicknamed the man with the golden flute, and it's true. His flute is all gold, and his tone is beautiful. If you ever have a chance to listen to any of his recordings or see any of his YouTube videos, I highly recommend it. And on the right here, we have a picture of an oboe section playing in an orchestra. Here on the left, we have bassoon players also playing in an orchestra. And on the right, filmmaker Woody Allen is playing the clarinet with his New Orleans Jazz Band in Stuttgart, Germany in 2004. All right, so next we have the brass instruments. These are still aerophones because we're blowing air through the instrument. And these instruments use a cup-shaped mouthpiece that's attached to the metal tubing, and it flares at the end into a bell. So it's going from the mouthpiece to a tube-like thing that kind of flares out into a bell at a certain distance. Now the pitch is changed by the slide or the valve, and the pressure of lips and breath. I want to tweak that a little bit, even though that's what it says in the book. But as an actual brass player, the pressure of the lips, I would say it's more the air speed that's coming out. We don't want to play with a super tight lips, because our lips are what are vibrating. So we're blowing air through our lips that are vibrating. For example, if you know how to motorboat, you're still blowing some air through, but your lips are flapping, they're vibrating. Now, if your lips are, if you have so much pressure on your lips, it's not going to be really easy to let that vibration occur. And if there isn't any vibration, then you're not going to actually hear any pitches. So your lips are vibrating, blowing air through this cup-shaped mouthpiece, and we have valves that we press down, or we have a slide that we're moving further away or closer to our body, and that's what changes the pitch. So the faster that your lips are vibrating, the higher the pitch. The slower your lips are vibrating, the lower the pitch. So the embouchure is the oral mechanism of the lips, the lower facial muscles, and the jaw. So it's how we shape our mouth while we're playing our instrument. So the embouchure is not just for brass players, it's also for woodwind players. Each instrument has its specific type of embouchure in order for the instrument to be played. So within this brass family, we have the trumpet, French horn, tuba, and trombone. And there are other instruments that are used more frequently than we would use in the orchestra itself. So other brass instruments are used in the concert and marching bands. And these would include the cornet, the bugle, flugelhorn, and euphonium. Here we have a picture of Alison Balsam. She is a fantastic trumpet player, and she's playing with an orchestra, primarily as a soloist in this picture. So when we look at the trumpet, you can see the little mouthpiece that's actually, in contact with her lips, and her trumpet. So you can see that tube, and it kind of coils around a little bit and then fans out into a bell. If we were to untwist the trumpet or any of the brass instruments, because you see a lot of coiling in it, that instrument would be a tube that's, a certain amount of distance or feet long. It's just really amazing, the mechanics of that. So basically, we're playing one really long tube, and we're just shortening or lengthening the length of that tube by pressing the valves, or in the case of the trombone, as we extend our slide, the pitches get lower. All right, next we have a picture here of Kenny Garrett. He plays the alto saxophone at a jazz festival in New York City. This was in 2013. And we can see that the alto sax here is made out of metal. Like I said before, it's a combination of the brass mechanics, or the brass metallic resonance with a woodwind reed to produce the sound. And on the right here, we have a picture of the French horn section of an orchestra. And you can see that there's a lot of coiling going on in that instrument. And the French horn's very special because the bell is really pronounced and fanned out. However, the bell goes towards the back. The instruments that you normally see, like the trumpet and the trombone, they have the bell in the front, but the French horn bell goes towards the back. And they use their right hand as they stick that hand in the bell to help with the shape of the sound. It's a really interesting that instrument. The French horn was used as a hunting horn. Horn calls for, while they're hunting, and the dogs would go get the stuff that was hunted, whether it was birds or other kinds of animals. The trumpets, originally were used in the military to signal calls for, strategic positions or commands or anything. It's another way to communicate, because that instrument sound could carry long distances. Okay. On the left here, we have a picture of Carol Jansch, and she's the principal tubist with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And she's really special because she made history as being like the youngest person to win a principal position. And a principal position is, the lead position or the main instrumentalist for that section. Now, even though there's only one tuba in the orchestra, that's it. You're that person. So it was a big deal when she won that position. And I had the opportunity to meet her when they came to Davis and played at Mondavi. And it's just really amazing. She has a really great sound, and she tours around and performs as a soloist as well. But these principal positions in these orchestras are super competitive, and you hold on to that seat until you die. So, there are very few open positions, and when they do, it's a lot of people auditioning for that top spot. And on the right here, we have an orchestral trombone player in rehearsal. Okay, so on to the percussion instruments. These are the idiophones or the membranophones. So we have a class of these instruments that are pitched, meaning that they can be tuned or they create a certain pitch note that you hear. The first group is the timpani or the kettle drums. And these are, large copper bowls that are stretched, that have a stretched calf skin or plastic head. And then there's a ring that kind of keeps them in place. And the pitch is changed by the pedals. And so usually they're used in pairs or in groups of 4. And like I said in class, there's a bass timpani, a tenor timpani, an alto timpani, and a soprano timpani. And depending on what's called for in the music, certain pitches would be used, and then you might need to retune and change with the pedal to change to different pitches. But you don't usually have a lot of different changing pitches because the timpani is usually used, as part of the harmony, the harmonic rhythm, as well as a rhythmic instrument. So if you're in a certain key, there's particular notes that you're just going to be using a lot of the time. You're not going to be chromatic and use half steps all over the place because that's not what the bass line or the harmony is indicating. All right, the next pitched instrument is the xylophone or the marimba. And these are blocks of wood that are tuned. So they're cut to a specific length. And because they're at a certain length, they have a frequency that creates a certain pitch. And these are struck with mallets. Sometimes these are harder mallets. Most of the time they are mallets that are covered in yarn, mainly to help protect the wood itself, because if you have a hard, really, really hard mallet striking against wood that's been aged and settled and acclimated, it could crack that wood. So I'm always yelling at our percussion students at ARC to use the right mallets on the instrument so that the instrument will last. Now, we also have a vibraphone, and the vibraphone looks like a xylophone and marimba, but it's made out of metal blocks instead of wood. And all of these mallet instruments, they have these resonators that kind of help resonate or echo the sound that's being struck. And on the vibraphone, these resonators are also enhanced by a motor. And you can exaggerate the vibrato, like what I did with my tuba with my chattering teeth, or it could be a slow vibrato. So as they're striking the metal bar, it will have a tone, but because the motor is rotating at a certain speed, that speed will determine how fast that vibration or vibrato is. All right, next we have the glockenspiel, and that's the set of bells. It looks like a piano because of the alternation of the half steps. We have the upper keys and the lower keys, like the black keys and white keys, but it's all metal bars, and these metal bars are struck with a really hard, like little hammer mallet. And when you hear it, it's a really piercing metallic sound, and this cuts through the sound of the overall group. It's very prevalent. Tongue twister there. Very prevalent in marching bands, or certain percussion pieces, but it really cuts through the rest of the sound, the rest of the orchestra or the band. Next, we have the chimes or the tubular bells, and these are tuned. So when we're saying tuned, they are cut to a certain length, and that creates that certain pitch. So these are metal tubes that are suspended on a frame, and they're struck with a hammer. And this hammer is more like a rawhide hammer, because you don't want to have a hard metal hitting steel tube that could dent it, and that would also change the resonance. So every time you're striking these instruments, it still needs to be protected by the thing that it's being struck with. And these tubular bells, they kind of mimic the sound of church bells, or when church service gets out, or even when you're on campus and you hear the clock strike, at the hour, and you hear the chiming for how many hours it is in the day. That's what that instrument sounds like. Next, here I have a picture of Evelyn Glennie, and she's a virtuoso percussionist, but she's also profoundly deaf. And when I first heard about her, I thought, wow, how is that possible? How is she able to perform and do all these things and be deaf? Well, she plays barefoot and feels the vibration in the floor through her feet. And you should take some time to listen to her too. She is really amazing. Next, we have another picture of an awesome performer. This is pianist Yuja Wang, and she's like the most sought after soloist today. She's very electrifying and energetic, and you could consider her kind of like a rock star in the classical world. So we talked about pitched percussion instruments. Now we're going to talk about the indefinite pitch, meaning that there really isn't a pitch, A, B, C, A flat, B flat. There isn't a pitch that you can really tie to that instrument when it's being struck. And the first one is the snare drum or the side drum. This one has two heads, one on the top, one on the bottom, and they're pulled really taut. And there are snares or strings that run across the lower head. So when the snares are on, it's a really loud rattling when it's being struck. And then when you turn the snares off, it sounds more like a tom, an open sounding deeper drum. Next, we have the bass drum, and this is that large drum that's played with a soft mallet. It's what keeps the pulse of the music. If you're thinking of, the marching band, or even just like the bugle days, there's just a boom, 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 boom. Especially when they're marching, it keeps the tempo, keeps them organized. And the other instruments that we have here are the tom-tom, the tambourine, the castanets. We have the triangle, cymbals, the gong, and the tam-tam. And depending on the type of music, these instruments serve different purposes. So, for example, the tom tom kind of sounds like the snare drum with the snares off, but this is a more hollower sound. And like the tambourine, we have a circular drum head in a way that has little metal discs in between, and those rattle. Castanets are these little cup-like things that are sitting on a wooden board, and you play with those with your fingers, and you can kind of think of it as like, I don't know, like clamshells or something that you're moving with your fingers. But that when you hear that, you think of Spanish music or maybe even Italian music, but it's very characteristic in like the Mediterranean. Then we have the triangle, that is a metal rod that's formed in the shape of a triangle, and you use a tiny metal stick to hit the inner or the outer part of that triangle. I always think of that as, the dinner call, like, dinner's ready, Johnny, come home, like the ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling. The cymbals are two metal discs that, are held with straps that you crash into each other, literally. Or they're suspended on a stand, and you can use mallets on those. And those create those like whoosh sounds, or even the crash sounds. The gong and the tam tam, these can vary in size, but they're a round metallic disc that's suspended, and you use a fluffy kind of mallet to hit close to the middle or around the sides, and it will just ring and ring and ring. This is prevalent in a lot of Asian music, but it's also used in orchestral music as well. And another interesting fact with the gong or the tam tam, you can't just strike that instrument and then that loud crash that you hear. You actually have to warm that instrument up. And so what you do, before the music says for it to be struck, you start to warm it up by kind of lightly tapping on the gong or the tam tam to get the vibrations going. And then when it's time to actually strike it, you'll get the right sound. Not a lot of people are aware of that, but you can't just bang the gong. All right, next we have the keyboard instruments. These are instruments that don't neatly fit into the Western classification. So, for example, with the piano, or originally known as the pianoforte, or forte piano, which is, translated to loud, soft. This instrument has strings inside, and these strings are struck with hammers. But it's funny because when we press our fingers down on the keys, that triggers the hammer to, strike the string, and creates the sound that way. Next, we have the organ, which it's still a wind instrument. Air flows to the pipes that are controlled by the keyboards and the pedal board. Now, the organ is pretty awesome. Not only are there, two decks, meaning if you look at a piano, you could consider that one deck. Now, the organ has two decks, so we got the lower deck and the upper deck, and the player can be playing on either deck or both decks at the same time, while also playing with their feet. Their feet are doing the actual bass line part, and they have to wear special shoes, or even no shoes or just socks, but they can't wear, regular street shoes while playing the organ, because they have to be able to move their feet quickly and make sure that they don't damage the bass pedals. Another cool story, my first orchestral, like really big work that I played at UC Davis was Mahler's Second Symphony, and this orchestra was just amazing. The piece itself, the symphony, it had soloists, it had a large chorus, and a full orchestra, and by the time we got to the last movement, it was just like this grandiose thing. And then we had the organ player join us. And the whole time I'm thinking, wow, when's the organ coming in? Then the organ came in, and the vibration of the organ in Mondavi was just so much. Everything was shaking, vibrating. I couldn't even see my music. I was shaking that much. But the organ had a little bit of help with subwoofers, but it was pretty powerful. And I had to sit out because it's like, I can't see what I'm playing and you can't even hear me anyway. So it was a very powerful moment. So anytime you get a chance to see an organ being played, there's another cool piece, the Camille Saint-Saëns Organ Symphony. That one is pretty awesome as well. It's literally a concerto for the organ with the symphony orchestra as the accompaniment. All right, lastly, we have the harpsichord. And this instrument has quills that pluck the metal strings. So instead of a hammer like the piano, the quill will pluck the metal string, and it creates this really tinny sound. And this is, the precursor to the forte piano, or the modern day piano. It's also a very, 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 very delicate instrument. So, piano players can't play the harpsichord like they play the piano. The forte piano is meant to be really durable and have different extremes of dynamic and virtuosity and all that stuff. But the harpsichord is quite fragile and can often be broken by an unknowing participant. I've had to get one repaired before. Anyway, so that does it for the instrument families and the aerophone, the chordophone, the idiophone, the membranophone. These are the way that these instruments produce sounds. That's how they're categorized. All right, next we'll be going over chapters 11 through 13.